He had survived enemy fire in 3 combat zones, watched brothers fall beside him, and carried wounds that never fully healed. But nothing, not a single mission, not a single battlefield, had prepared Ethan Carter for the night he stood in a half-empty office building in Chicago and made a choice that destroyed everything he had spent 6 years building. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't calculate odds. He simply stepped forward. And that one step cost him his job, his stability, and very nearly his daughter's future. What he didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that the fragile old woman hunched over a mop bucket wasn't who she appeared to be. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe and follow so you never miss what comes next, because the stories on this channel only get more intense from here. The office building at night had a particular kind of quiet that Ethan Carter had learned to distrust. It wasn't the clean silence of an empty space. It was the held breath quiet of people pretending not to be there. Heads down, keyboards tapping at half speed, eyes trained on screens while ears stayed tuned to every sound that wasn't their own. Ethan had learned to read that kind of quiet during his years in the Navy. It meant people were afraid. And when people were afraid, something had already gone wrong. He was still at his desk at 9:47 on a Wednesday night because the inventory reconciliation report for the Midwest Distribution Network was due Thursday morning, and the numbers still weren't matching. 3 pallets of high-value electronics had disappeared somewhere between the Memphis transfer point and the Chicago receiving dock, and Ethan had been staring at shipping manifests for 4 hours trying to find where they'd gone. His back hurt. His coffee was cold. He hadn't eaten since a granola bar at 2 in the afternoon. His phone buzzed on the desk. He glanced at it. Emma. Daddy, are you coming home soon? He picked it up and typed back quickly. Soon, baby. Maybe an hour. You in bed? 3 dots appeared, then her reply. Mrs. Patterson said I have to be in bed by 9, but I told her you said 9:30. He smiled despite himself. Mrs. Patterson is right. 9 o'clock. I'll check on you when I get home. Okay. Love you, Daddy. Love you too. He set the phone face down and rubbed his eyes. Emma was 7 years old and already running negotiations like a seasoned contractor. She'd gotten that from her mother, the ability to find the precise angle of any argument and press it until something gave. Her mother had been gone for 4 years now. A car accident on the I-90 on a gray February morning while Emma was at kindergarten and Ethan was 3,000 miles away on assignment. By the time he got the call, it was already over. He had left the Navy 8 months after that, not because the grief made him weak. If anything, it sharpened him, stripped away everything that wasn't essential. He left because Emma needed a father who came home, a father who was present, a father she could count on to be there when she woke up scared at 2 in the morning, or when her kidneys flared up and she needed to be at the clinic before school, or just on a Tuesday night when she wanted to tell him about what happened at recess. His daughter had a chronic kidney condition that required regular monitoring, medication adjustments, and occasional hospital stays. Nothing immediately life-threatening, the doctors were careful to say that, but the kind of thing that needed consistent management, good insurance, and a father who wasn't deployed to a location he couldn't name on a map. So Ethan had traded his clearance for a cubicle. He had translated 6 years of military logistics experience into a supply chain analyst position at Meridian Global Logistics, one of the largest distribution companies in the Midwest. The pay was decent, the insurance was good, the work was grinding and repetitive and occasionally soul-draining, but it kept Emma fed and medicated and enrolled in a school where her teacher actually knew her name. It was enough. He told himself that regularly. He was refilling his coffee in the break room when he heard the voice. It came from the corridor near the East Wing, the section of the floor that housed the executive support offices, the filing rooms, and the janitorial storage. At this hour, that wing was supposed to be empty. Ethan paused in the doorway of the break room with his mug in his hand. The voice was Victor Hales. He recognized it immediately. Victor was the regional director of the Chicago branch. Mid-50s, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who had learned early in his career that volume and certainty could substitute for intelligence if deployed correctly. He wore expensive suits that were slightly too tight across the shoulders, smiled at people he needed, and looked through people he didn't, and had a reputation for making examples of employees who questioned his decisions. Ethan had been careful around Victor. Everyone was. He set his mug down quietly on the break room counter and moved to the corridor. The scene he found was simple and ugly. An elderly woman stood in the hallway with a mop in one hand and a wheeled bucket beside her, her head bent forward and her shoulders pulled in tight. She was maybe 70, small-framed, with white hair tucked under a gray service cap and a cleaning uniform that was slightly too large for her. Her name tag read Clara. A wet puddle spread across the linoleum near the baseboard, a spilled bucket from the looks of it. Victor stood over her, close enough that she would have had to tilt her head back to see his face. He wasn't touching her. He didn't need to. His posture alone was a kind of violence, chest forward, jaw tight, the deliberate physical presence of a man who had practiced intimidation long enough that it had become instinct. "Do you have any idea?" Victor said, his voice low and controlled in a way that was somehow worse than shouting, "what kind of damage standing water does to these floors? This is Italian marble tile. You've been told. You've been told multiple times. And you're still standing here dripping water all over a floor that costs more per square foot than you make in a month." The woman didn't respond. She stood perfectly still, the way people stand when they've learned that moving makes things worse. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Her voice was steady, which seemed to surprise Victor slightly. "It was an accident. I'll clean it up right away." An accident. Victor repeated it like the word itself offended him. "You people always have an accident, don't you? Some excuse. Some reason why it's never actually your fault." He stepped slightly to the side, forcing her to shift her weight, a small territorial move that probably wasn't even conscious. "You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to have your supervisor pulled in here tomorrow morning, and I'm going to make it very clear that this floor is managed by incompetents who can't be trusted with basic—" "Enough!" The word came out of Ethan before he had fully decided to say it. Victor turned. The expression on his face wasn't surprise exactly. It was the particular irritation of a man who has been interrupted during something he was enjoying. His eyes moved over Ethan, cataloging him the way people catalog things they consider beneath serious attention. "Carter." Victor's voice shifted, settling into the particular register he used with people several rungs below him. "I didn't realize anyone else was still here. This doesn't concern you." "I think it does." Ethan kept his voice level. He had learned over years of operating in high-pressure environments that volume was almost never the right tool. What mattered was clarity. What mattered was that every word landed exactly where you intended it. She spilled a bucket. "That's what mops are for." The elderly woman had lifted her head slightly. She was watching Ethan with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not relief exactly, not surprise, something more careful than either of those. Victor drew himself up to his full height. He had 2 inches on Ethan and outweighed him by probably 30 pounds, and he clearly expected that to register. "You want to be very careful about the next thing that comes out of your mouth," he said. "I don't know what you think you're doing right now, but you're making a serious mistake." "Am I?" It wasn't a question. "You have a daughter," Victor said. The shift in his tone was deliberate, a door swinging open to show what was behind it. 7 years old, right? Medical situation. You're a single father. You need this job." He let that sit for a moment. "So I'm going to give you the chance to walk back to your desk and pretend you didn't see anything, and we can all go back to our evening." There it was. The quiet architecture of a threat, all the bones of it visible, none of them quite touchable. Ethan had been in rooms with worse men than Victor Hale. He had negotiated with people who held guns, who held hostages, who held the kind of authority that came attached to genuine violence. He knew the difference between a threat and a fact, and he knew that what made a threat powerful was the willingness of the person receiving it to believe it. "I appreciate the offer," Ethan said, "but you should probably stop." Victor stared at him for a long moment. Then something in his expression settled into something colder and more final. "Clear your desk tonight," he said. "Your access card will be deactivated by morning." He turned and walked away down the corridor without looking back. Ethan stood in the hallway with the sound of Victor's footsteps fading and the low hum of the building's ventilation system filling the space they left behind. The reality of what had just happened was arriving in stages. First the immediate clarity, then the first edges of something heavier and more complicated. He turned to the woman beside him. She was looking at him directly now, and there was something in her eyes that didn't match the rest of her appearance. Not gratitude exactly, more like someone who had been quietly taking notes for a long time. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know. He'll make good on it." "Yeah, he probably will." Ethan looked at the spill on the floor, then at the mop still in her hand. "Do you need help cleaning that up?" She almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely there. "I've got it." He nodded. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet. An old habit, some reflex from a life where you looked after the person beside you. And he set a 20 on the edge of the cleaning cart without fully thinking it through. "For the cab home," he said, "if you need it." She looked at the bill for a moment. Then she looked at him again with that same expression he couldn't quite categorize. "Thank you," she said. Ethan walked back to his desk, packed his laptop and the papers he'd been working on into his bag, and rode the elevator down to the lobby. The security guard at the front desk wished him a good night. He pushed through the revolving door and out into the Chicago night, cold and sharp, the kind of cold that cuts right through a coat that's just slightly not warm enough, and stood on the sidewalk for a moment with his bag over his shoulder. He thought about Emma asleep in her bed 3 miles away. He thought about her next clinic appointment, the medication that cost $400 a month after his insurance discount. He thought about the mortgage on the house they had stayed in after Lauren died because Emma needed something to stay the same, at least one thing to stay the same. Then he pulled out his phone, called the car service he used when it was too late for the train, and watched his breath turn to vapor in the cold air while he waited. He didn't regret what he had done. He had understood the cost when he stepped forward, and he had stepped forward anyway, and he wasn't going to spend the ride home pretending he'd made a mistake. That wasn't how he was built. It wasn't the kind of father he was trying to be either, the kind who taught his daughter that the right thing to do was the thing that protected your own position. But he was 32 years old with a sick kid and a mortgage and no job as of tomorrow morning, and the weight of that was real and specific and wasn't going anywhere. The car came. He got in. The driver had the heater going and a Spanish-language radio station playing low, and Ethan sat in the back seat and watched the city move past the window and thought about what the morning was going to look like. He thought about calling his old CO, about the contacts he had from his SEAL days who had transitioned into private security or federal consulting. He thought about the resume he hadn't updated in 2 years, and the reference from his previous supervisor at Meridian who had left the company 6 months ago. He thought about Emma asking him at breakfast tomorrow why he was home. He hadn't let her see him scared since the day he sat across from her at the kitchen table and told her that Mommy wasn't coming back. He had held himself together for that conversation through something that felt like controlled demolition, carefully, deliberately, making sure only the right things fell and only in the right order. He had held her while she cried, and he had not cried himself until she was asleep, and he was sitting alone in the dark in the garage. He could do it again. He could hold himself together through breakfast, send her to school with her lunch and her medication in her bag, and then sit down at the kitchen table with his laptop and start making calls. He was good at getting through things. He had always been good at getting through things. The car pulled up in front of his house. The porch light was on. He always left it on. He paid the driver, climbed the steps, and unlocked the front door as quietly as he could. The house smelled like the macaroni Mrs. Patterson had made for Emma's dinner. There was a drawing on the kitchen table, a crayon picture of what appeared to be a dog, though they didn't own a dog, and Emma had been campaigning for one with increasing creativity and desperation for the past several months. He smiled at it despite himself. He checked on Emma. She was asleep with her arm curled under her pillow and her nightlight casting its familiar pale circle on the wall, and she looked so utterly at ease in the way that only sleeping children look, completely undefended, completely trusting in the safety of the space around her. He stood in her doorway for a moment. "I'll figure it out," he thought. Not as a reassurance, exactly. More as a statement of intent. The kind of thing you say to yourself when sentiment isn't useful and what you need instead is a direction. He pulled her door almost shut, went back to the kitchen, sat down at the table. He opened his laptop and started writing his resume. He updated his resume until 2 in the morning. Not because it took that long. The document itself came together in under an hour, a clean accounting of his experience that translated Navy logistics and supply chain command into corporate language that hiring managers could actually read. He'd done that translation before, when he first left the military, sitting at the same kitchen table with a mug of coffee and a stack of civilian job postings that described roles he'd been performing for 6 years, using words he'd never been trained to say. He'd figured it out then. He could figure it out again. The extra hours were something else. They were the thing he did instead of sleeping, instead of sitting in the quiet with the full weight of the situation pressing down on him from every direction. Updating the LinkedIn profile, researching competing logistics firms in the Chicago metro area, cross-referencing his Meridian contacts against people who had moved to other companies in the past 18 months, who might remember him, who might take a call. He went to bed at 2:15 and lay in the dark with his eyes open until sometime after 3. Emma woke him at 6:45 by climbing onto his bed and sitting on his feet, which was her standard method of ensuring he didn't hit snooze. He grunted into the pillow. "You're home," she said, with the particular satisfaction of someone who had suspected this and was now confirmed. "I'm home." He rolled onto his back. She was sitting cross-legged at the foot of the bed in her pajamas, the ones with the small foxes on them, her hair doing something complicated on one side from sleeping on it. "Morning. It's almost 7. Mrs. Patterson said you didn't get home until late." Mrs. Patterson was right. He sat up. His neck hurt. "You take your morning medication?" "Not yet." "Go do that. I'll make breakfast." She hopped off the bed. At the door, she turned back with the expression she wore when she was calculating something. "Are you okay?" He looked at her. 7 years old, and she had already developed an accuracy about him that sometimes caught him off guard. Lauren had been the same way. The ability to read a room through a closed door. "Yeah," he said. "I'm good. Eggs or oatmeal?" "Eggs, with the cheese. Go take your medication." She went. He sat on the edge of the bed for a moment with his hands on his knees, staring at the floor, then stood up. He made eggs with the cheese. He made her lunch, a turkey sandwich, cut diagonally because she'd once informed him that diagonal was better and he had never questioned it, and filled her water bottle and found the permission slip for the school field trip that had been sitting on the counter for 3 days and was due today. He signed it while she ate, standing at the counter. "Mrs. Patterson said you work too much," Emma announced between bites. "Mrs. Patterson's not wrong. She said you should get a hobby." "I have hobbies." Emma tilted her head. "Like what?" He thought about it. "Running. That's not a hobby. That's just exercise." "Where'd you hear that?" "School." He poured himself coffee. The kitchen smelled like eggs and dish soap and the particular morning smell of the house that he had never been able to identify, but would probably recognize anywhere for the rest of his life. "Go get dressed," he said. "Bus comes in 20 minutes. She finished her eggs, rinsed her plate the way he'd taught her, not clean, just rinsed, and disappeared upstairs. He stood at the kitchen window with his coffee and looked at the backyard. The lawn needed mowing. There was a section of fencing along the back left corner where a board had warped away from the post, and he'd been meaning to fix it for 2 weeks. He thought, I have time for that now. Then he thought, don't. He drove Emma to the bus stop because there was black ice on the sidewalk, and she climbed out of the car and waved at him from the corner with her backpack over both shoulders and her jacket slightly unzipped despite his instructions, and he watched the bus take her before he drove home. He sat at the kitchen table with his phone and his laptop and his coffee and started making calls. By noon, he had spoken to 4 people. One had a position that might open up in 6 to 8 weeks. One suggested he reach out to a freight brokerage firm downtown. One was genuinely sorry and genuinely useless. One had left Meridian under circumstances similar enough to Ethan's that the conversation turned into a mutual venting session that lasted 40 minutes and produced nothing actionable. He ate a sandwich standing over the sink because sitting down for lunch alone in the middle of a weekday felt like something he didn't want to practice yet. His phone buzzed. Unknown number, Chicago area code. He picked it up. "Carter?" "Mr. Carter." The voice on the other end was female, professional, with the particular smooth efficiency of someone who made calls like this all day. My name is Dana Reyes. I'm calling from the Executive Office of Meridian Global Logistics on behalf of senior leadership. We'd like to arrange a meeting with you at the headquarters building. Would you be available tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock? Ethan set his sandwich down. What kind of meeting? A private one, with senior leadership. That's not an answer. A brief pause. I understand. I can tell you that it's not a disciplinary meeting, Mr. Carter, and that senior leadership is aware of the events of last night. They'd like to speak with you in person. He turned that over carefully. The executive office had called, not HR, not legal, not Victor Hale's assistant, the executive office. And whoever was running this particular call had specifically said not disciplinary, which meant someone had anticipated that would be his first concern, which meant someone understood enough about the situation to prepare for his reaction. 9 o'clock, he said. I'll be there. He spent the rest of the afternoon trying to figure out what that meant and coming up empty. Ichab, 214 miles away, in a corner office on the 34th floor of the Meridian Global Headquarters building in downtown Cincinnati, Claire Morgan was eating a protein bar at her desk and reading Ethan Carter's personnel file for the second time. She had slept 4 hours. This was not unusual. Claire had run on compressed sleep since her mid-20s, when she was managing her first turnaround and discovered that the hours between midnight and 4 a.m. were the most honest ones. No one calling, no one needing anything, just the work itself. The personnel file was thinner than she expected for someone with his background. 6 years active duty Navy, honorable discharge, 2 commendations she couldn't find details on because they were classified. Then a gap of 3 months, which she now understood to be the period immediately following his wife's death, and then Meridian. 2 years as a logistics coordinator, 8 months as a senior analyst, quarterly performance reviews that were uniformly good without being remarkable. The kind of reviews that happened when someone was doing their job correctly, and their supervisor didn't have the observational range to notice what was actually going on. She flipped to the flagged sections her assistant had pulled. 3 instances in his 18 months as an analyst where he had identified inventory discrepancies that other team members had missed or let slide. 1 internal memo he had written about inefficiencies in the Memphis to Chicago transfer protocol that had been ignored at the regional level. She recognized Victor Hale's signature on the dismissal note, and that proposed a routing adjustment she now calculated would have saved approximately $240,000 in the most recent fiscal quarter alone. Claire set the protein bar down and looked at the memo. It was cleanly written, not showy, not the kind of thing that was trying to impress. Just clear and specific, walking through the problem and the proposed solution in plain language that assumed the reader was intelligent enough to follow the logic without needing it dressed up. The kind of writing you saw from people who had spent years producing documents where the clarity of the information was the difference between success and a serious problem. She had gone undercover at the Chicago branch because the numbers out of that office had been wrong for 11 months. Not dramatically wrong. Victor Hale was too careful for that. But wrong in the specific patterned way that meant someone was managing them rather than reporting them. Expense figures that landed just below scrutiny thresholds. Performance metrics that improved in the 2 weeks before quarterly reviews and drifted afterward. Turnover rates that nobody in the home office had connected to the regional director's management style because nobody at the home office was paying close enough attention to ask why. She had been paying attention. She had been paying attention for a long time, and what she had learned, in 11 years of building and repairing companies, was that numbers told you something was wrong, but they almost never told you why. For that, you needed to see the place. Not through reports, not through department heads who had been coached on what to say when the CEO called. You needed to see it the way the people at the bottom saw it. So she had arranged a 2-week absence from the Cincinnati office. Carefully managed, her inner circle sworn to silence, her schedule handled by her COO. And flown to Chicago with a fabricated contract staffing profile, a set of clothes she'd purchased specifically for the purpose, and the kind of practiced invisibility that she had discovered came naturally to women who were not what people expected them to be in a given space. People did not expect a 30-year-old woman in a cleaning uniform to be watching them. That was the most useful thing about the operation. The assumptions people brought with them were enormous, and those assumptions were load-bearing walls in the structure of their behavior. Victor Hale, in particular, had never once looked at her and registered another person. She was furniture. Furniture that needed to be yelled at occasionally when it underperformed. She had collected what she needed in the first 10 days. Financial irregularities, a pattern of intimidation she had witnessed directly and documented and cross-referenced against the exit interview records she had her assistant quietly pull. A department full of people who had learned to do their jobs with their heads down and their mouths shut and their primary professional energy directed toward not attracting Victor's attention. Then, the last night. She had knocked over the bucket on purpose. She wanted to see what he did without any audience that mattered, when there was no one in the room who could report him to anyone who cared. What he did was exactly what she expected. The controlled, habitual cruelty of someone who had been doing this for years without consequence, who had learned to use fear as a management tool and had long since stopped distinguishing between using it and enjoying it. What she hadn't expected was the man who stepped into the corridor. She had noticed Ethan Carter before that night. Hard not to. He was one of approximately 3 people in the Chicago office who appeared to be running on actual competence rather than political positioning. She had watched him at his desk on the 4th floor, working late when most of the analysts had already left, cross-checking shipping records with the focused patience of someone who actually cared whether the numbers were right. She had seen him stop in the break room to help a newer employee figure out the inventory management software without making the other person feel stupid for asking. Small things. The kind of thing that didn't show up in performance reviews. But watching someone behave decently in daylight conditions was a different thing from watching someone make a choice in the dark. When he stepped into that corridor, she had clocked everything about it. The moment of hesitation before he spoke, barely half a second. The kind of pause where a person weighs what they're about to do and does it anyway. The steadiness of his voice when he told Victor to stop. The way he stood, not aggressive, not posturing, just present and completely immovable. And then afterward, when Victor had fired him and walked away, Ethan had looked at her, not with the expression of someone who wanted to be thanked for what they'd done, but with the simple practical concern of someone checking that the person beside them was okay. The $20 had undone her slightly, not because of the amount, obviously, but because of the instinct behind it. An automatic gesture from a man who had just been fired and was standing in a hallway calculating what it was going to cost him, who still reached into his wallet. She had held that bill in her hand in the car back to her hotel and sat with it for a long time. Now she picked up her phone and called her COO. "Tell me what happened after I left the building last night," she said when Marcus picked up. Hale filed the termination paperwork at 10:17 p.m. Marcus's voice had the particular flatness of someone reporting information they personally found offensive. Called his assistant from the parking garage. Had building security flag Carter's access card for deactivation by 6 a.m. Did he document a reason? Insubordination? Interference with management decisions? Great. She turned her chair to face the window. Cincinnati was gray and cold outside, the river low and dark between its banks. I want the full audit package ready by tomorrow morning. Everything we have on Hale, the financial irregularities, the modified reports, the turnover documentation, the intimidation pattern. I want it clean, and I want it sourced. No loose ends. It'll be ready, Marcus said. Then, are you flying to Chicago? Tonight. I have a 9 a.m. meeting. A pause. With Carter. With Carter. She stood up, moved to the window. And I want Hale in that building tomorrow morning, too. Don't tell him why. Tell him there's a quarterly review. He'll suspect something. He'll suspect a lot of things. That's fine. She looked at the city below, the grid of streets and the tiny crawl of cars and all the ordinary machinery of a day in progress. Make sure Carter's meeting is first. Ethan arrived at the Meridian headquarters building in Cincinnati at 8:45 because arriving anywhere less than 15 minutes early was something he had genuinely never learned how to do. He wore the charcoal suit he kept for interviews. The only formal suit he owned, bought off the rack 3 years ago, and altered by a tailor near his house, who charged a reasonable price and did good work. He had the jacket pressed last night, standing in the kitchen with the ironing board out while Emma did her homework at the table and periodically informed him about things that had happened at school. The headquarters building was a 36-story glass and steel construction that took up most of a city block, with the Meridian logo cut into the stone above the main entrance and a lobby that was all polished granite and ambient light and the particular hushed movement of people who worked somewhere that took itself seriously. Ethan walked in, gave his name to the security desk, and received a visitor badge and directions to the executive elevator. He rode up to the 34th floor with his hands loose at his sides and his eyes forward, running a quiet inventory of the building out of habit. Camera placements, exit stairwells, the security protocols visible at each level as the elevator ascended. He had stopped apologizing to himself for that kind of automatic assessment a long time ago. It was just how he moved through spaces. The executive floor opened onto a reception area done in muted grays and warm wood, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city. The assistant who met him was the woman from the phone call, Dana Reyes, mid-30s, efficient and professional in a way that suggested she had seen considerably stranger things than this and was not particularly impressed by any of them. "Mr. Carter, thank you for coming." She led him down a corridor past closed office doors. "Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water?" "I'm fine. Thank you." She stopped at a set of double doors near the end of the corridor and pressed her badge to the reader. The doors opened into a boardroom. Long table, 12 chairs, the kind of room designed to make people feel the weight of whatever happened inside it. The windows on the far wall looked out over the city. Victor Hale was already there. Ethan registered him in the first second. The expensive suit, the set of his jaw, the slight adjustment in his posture when he saw Ethan come through the door. A recalibration between surprise and contempt that settled quickly back into contempt, because contempt was more comfortable. "Carter?" Victor's voice was exactly what it had been 2 nights ago in that hallway, the careful performance of a man reminding you of his position. "I have to admit, I'm surprised you showed up. Most people with the sense to know when they've made a mistake would have just cleaned out their desk and moved on." Ethan walked to the far side of the table and stood, not beside Victor, not near him, across the room, with the table between them. "I was invited," he said. "You were invited as a courtesy." Victor pulled out a chair and sat, settling into it the way men settle into chairs they consider theirs by right. "Whatever you think is happening here, I'll tell you plainly what is happening. You interfered with the management decision, you created a scene in front of other employees, and you were terminated for cause. The meeting today is procedural. HR will walk you through your severance, you'll sign what needs to be signed, and that'll be it." Ethan said nothing. He had noticed when he came through the door that there were 3 chairs arranged at the head of the table, the formal setup of a meeting where someone was going to be making a presentation. Victor had positioned himself at the side, not the head. Whatever this meeting was, Victor didn't know the full shape of it either. That was interesting. He waited. The doors opened. She was wearing a white button-down shirt and dark slacks and her hair pulled back, and she walked into the room without looking at either of them first, setting a tablet on the table and exchanging a brief word with Dana Reyes at the door. And in those first few seconds, Ethan's brain was processing the information in pieces, the way it sometimes did when something arrived in a context where it didn't fit. The face, the eyes, the particular quality of attention in them. He recognized her. He just couldn't immediately find where the recognition connected because the person standing at the head of the boardroom table looked like someone who had spent her entire adult life in rooms like this one, while the person he was trying to match her to had been holding a mop in a service corridor 2 nights ago. Then it clicked. Victor had risen from his chair when she came in, straightening automatically with the reflexive deference of a man who recognized authority. "Miss Morgan," he started, "I'm glad you're here. I think there may have been some miscommunication about—" "Sit down, Victor." She didn't look at him. She was looking at Ethan. He stood very still on the far side of the table, and for a moment neither of them spoke. And he understood, in the specific, irreversible way of understanding something that immediately rearranges everything you thought you knew about a situation, exactly what she was. She reached into the tablet case and set something on the table, a folded $20 bill. His $20 bill. He recognized it by the tear along one edge that had been there when he pulled it from his wallet. Victor was looking at the bill without understanding what it meant. His expression moved through confusion towards something colder and more cautious as he looked from the bill to Claire to Ethan and began, slowly, to understand that the geography of this room was not what he had believed it to be when he sat down. "You were the cleaning woman," Ethan said. His voice came out level. He was proud of that. "Clara," Claire said. And there it was. The same steadiness, the same quality of attention he had registered in that corridor, now placed correctly in a face that belonged to a woman who owned the company he worked for. "That's the name on the badge." Victor had gone very still. Ethan looked at Claire Morgan, CEO of Meridian Global Logistics, a company with 14 regional offices and approximately 4,000 employees, and thought, with the particular clarity that arrived in high-pressure moments, that she had gone to considerable trouble to see something she needed to see. "Why?" he said. Not accusatory, genuine. She considered the question as though she'd been waiting for it. "Because the numbers were wrong," she said. "And numbers being wrong means people are making them wrong, and I needed to understand which people and how. And now you do." "Now I do." She looked at him steadily. "And now I understand some other things, too." Victor stood abruptly, his chair scraping back. "I don't know what you think you saw," he said, his voice finding a new register, tighter, higher, the sound of a man whose footing has shifted and who is not yet ready to admit it. "Claire, whatever Carter told you about that night—" "Sit down," she said again, and this time there was something in her voice that was completely quiet and completely final, and Victor sat. She opened her tablet, turned it to face the room, and began. The documents came up one by one. Ethan watched Victor's face as each one appeared on the screen. The falsified quarterly projections, the expense reports, the pattern of modified metrics that had been hiding an 11-month slide in actual performance behind numbers engineered to land just under the threshold of scrutiny. The employment records, the exit interviews, the timeline of turnover events cross-referenced against documented incidents in Victor's management history. Victor's face went through several things in the space of about 4 minutes. Surprise, then a brief performance of outrage, then the beginning of an argument about context and interpretation, then something that settled into a stillness that Ethan recognized as the moment a person understands that the argument is over and what remains is just the counting of damage. "I built this branch," Victor said quietly when she finished. "Whatever you think those numbers show, I think they show exactly what they show," Claire said, "and I think you've known what they show for a long time." She closed the tablet. Victor looked at Ethan across the table, a long, flat look, without the contempt now, just the bare acknowledgement of a man who had miscalculated the landscape he was standing on. Then he looked away. "Dana is outside," Claire said. "She'll walk you through the process." Victor stood, straightened his jacket with the automatic dignity of someone performing a final version of a role they've inhabited for years, and walked out of the room without speaking again. The doors closed behind him. The room was very quiet. Claire looked at Ethan. He looked back at her. The $20 bill sat on the table between them. "I want to apologize," she said. "For what?" "For putting you in a position where you had to make a choice that cost you something real. I made the choice myself." "I know." She sat down, not at the head of the table, but in the chair beside the one he'd been standing near, the same side of the table. "That's exactly the problem. I've been running this company for 6 years. I've sat across from a lot of people in boardrooms exactly like this one. Smart people, credentialed people, people with very expensive MBAs and very detailed 5-year plans." She paused. "I can count on one hand how many of them would have done what you did in that hallway." Ethan sat down across from her. He wasn't sure when he'd decided to sit, but it felt like the right response to the shift in the room's energy. She had stopped performing CEO and was just talking to him, and the least he could do was meet that. "I wasn't thinking about what it cost," he said. "I was thinking about what it was." She looked at him for a moment. What do you mean? The situation. He turned the coffee cup in front of him. Someone had set up cups and water, the anonymous hospitality of meeting rooms. You see someone doing something wrong, you do something about it. That's not a calculation. That's just what the moment is. Most people don't experience it that way. I know. He looked at the 20 on the table. Is that why you kept it? She looked at the bill too. I kept it because I needed to remember that there was someone in that building who was still making decisions like that. She looked up. I wanted to know who you were. And now you do. And now I do, she said. And then, almost to herself, I think I might have a problem. He raised an eyebrow. Because I need someone to rebuild that branch, she said. And the person who probably could do it is sitting across this table. And I just spent 20 minutes explaining to myself why that's a completely rational decision based on documented evidence of his capabilities. And the problem? She met his eyes. The problem is, I'm not entirely sure it's only rational. The words sat in the room. Outside the windows, Cincinnati moved through its ordinary morning, traffic and weather, and all the unremarkable operations of a city conducting its business. And inside this particular room, something had shifted in a way that neither of them was quite ready to name. Tell me what you need, Ethan said. And she told him. She told him about the branch the way a doctor describes a patient they're worried about. Not catastrophizing, but not softening it either. Straight information, delivered in the order that mattered. The Chicago branch had been Victor Hale's territory for 4 years. In that time, it had gone from a mid-performing regional office to something that looked healthy on paper and was quietly rotting underneath. The modified metrics Claire had shown Victor in the boardroom were only part of it. Deeper in, there were vendor contracts that had been renegotiated in ways that benefited the contractors without any corresponding improvement in service. A warehouse management system that was theoretically upgraded 18 months ago and had, according to the people actually using it, made things worse in 3 specific ways that nobody in Victor's office had bothered to document because documenting problems had become, in that particular environment, a career risk. The people. That was the part she came back to. I spent 10 days in that building, she said, talking to people who had stopped expecting things to get better. They weren't angry anymore. That's the part that worried me most. The ones who were still angry, they were still fighting something. The ones I talked to in the break room, on the loading dock, they'd gotten past anger into something flatter. They showed up because the paycheck cleared and the commute was manageable and leaving felt like too much energy. How many have actually left in the last year, Ethan asked. 11% annual turnover in the analyst and coordinator tier. Industry average for our sector is around 6. He was quiet for a moment, working the numbers. So almost double. Almost double. And the ones who left were disproportionately the people you'd want to keep, the ones who had options. That tracked with what Ethan had observed from inside. The colleagues he'd respected most in his 18 months at Chicago had a way of disappearing, quietly, with 2 weeks' notice, and a going-away cake in the break room that nobody seemed entirely sure how to feel about. He hadn't connected the pattern to Victor directly because he hadn't been looking for a pattern. He'd been keeping his head down and his daughter's insurance active. What's the timeline you're working with? He said. The board reviews regional performance in 14 weeks. Right now, Chicago is the answer to the question of why Midwest numbers are soft. She turned the tablet over in her hands. A small, restless motion, the first one he'd seen from her. If I can show a credible recovery trajectory by then, we have room. If I can't, there are people on that board who have wanted to restructure the Midwest operation for 2 years, and they'll have a legitimate argument. Restructure meaning what? Consolidate Chicago into the Indianapolis hub. Eliminate the branch as an independent operation. She looked at him steadily. Which means approximately 230 jobs. Ethan sat with that for a moment. 230 people. The ones who had already been through 4 years of Victor Hale, who had gotten past anger into that flat, exhausted place Claire was describing, who were now potentially looking at the branch closing because the man who had created the problem had hidden it well enough that it wasn't visible until the damage was substantial. What are you asking me to do? He said. Interim Regional Operations Director. It's not a permanent offer. I want to be clear about that. 14 weeks with a full review at the end. You'd have authority over operations, personnel decisions, vendor relationships. I'd want weekly reports, and I'd want them honest, not the kind of reports Victor was sending. I'm not Victor. No, she said. You're not. A pause. The compensation package is commensurate with the role. I'll have Dana send you the details this afternoon. You'll have time to look at it and think. Ethan looked at the 20 on the table again. I don't need to think, he said. She studied him. You should. I've been a SEAL, he said. I'm reasonably comfortable making decisions on incomplete information under time pressure. 14 weeks, honest reporting, actual authority. That's enough to work with. Something in her expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but the thing before a smile, the place where a smile considers whether it's warranted. There are conditions. There are always conditions. I'll be in Chicago, she said. Not continuously. I have a company to run, but regularly. I'm not sending someone in to fix a problem and then watching from Cincinnati. He considered that. You want to see the work. I want to understand what I'm looking at when the numbers start changing. I need to know the difference between a real recovery and a better class of modified metrics. That's fair? And I'll want to meet your team before you make any major personnel decisions. Not to override you, sir. You have the authority. That's not performative. I just want to see how you assess people. Also fair. He leaned back slightly. Anything else? She looked at him for a moment, and there was something in that look that he filed away without examining it directly. The particular quality of attention from someone who is seeing more than they're saying. I think that's enough to start with, she said. They shook hands across the table, and the $20 bill sat between them like a small, folded fact about the kind of people they both turned out to be. He drove back to Chicago that afternoon with the signed interim agreement in his bag and a compensation summary on his phone that he had read 3 times in the parking garage before starting the car, because the number still seemed like something that belonged to a different version of his life. He called Mrs. Patterson from the highway and told her he'd be home by 6:30. He asked about Emma. Mrs. Patterson said Emma had informed her that diagonal sandwiches tasted better and had spent 20 minutes attempting to prove this scientifically, which seemed about right. He didn't tell anyone else. Not yet. There was superstition in it, and he knew there was superstition in it, but he had learned years ago that certain things needed to be real before you could talk about them out loud. The agreement was signed, and the calls were made, and the paperwork was in motion, but he hadn't walked back into that building yet, hadn't sat in that office, hadn't looked at the actual state of the operation from a position where he could do something about it. Until then, it was a document in a bag. Emma was doing homework at the kitchen table when he got home, with a half-eaten apple beside her notebook and a colored pencil tucked behind her ear that she appeared to have forgotten about. You had a meeting, she said, without looking up. I did. You're wearing your interview suit. Good eye. She looked up, studied him the way she studied things that interested her, with her full attention, her head slightly tilted. Did you get a new job? He sat down across from her. Something like that. What does something like that mean? It means yes, but the full version is complicated. She processed this. Is it better than the old one? Yeah, he said. It's better. She nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to her homework. After a moment, she said without looking up, I told Jalen at school that my dad is the kind of person who does the right thing, even when it's hard. Ethan was quiet. He said his dad says that's stupid, Emma continued, but I told him his dad was wrong. His dad's not entirely wrong, Ethan said carefully. Doing the right thing when it's hard has real costs. That's worth knowing. Emma considered this. But you did it anyway. Yeah. So the cost didn't change what the right thing was. He looked at his daughter, 7 years old, working this out with the same focused patience she applied to everything, and thought that Lauren would have had a lot to say about where she got that particular quality. And then he thought that he knew exactly where she got it, and it wasn't from him. No, he said. They didn't. She nodded again, making the small internal adjustment of someone filing information in the right place. Can we have tacos tonight? We can have tacos tonight. What? He was back in Chicago on Monday morning. The Meridian Regional Office occupied floors 3 through 7 of a commercial building on West Jackson, a 15-minute train ride from his house in a neighborhood that had been a reasonable compromise between the school district Emma needed and the rent he could manage 2 years ago. He knew the building's rhythms, which elevator ran slow, which stairwell door didn't close fully, where the cell reception dropped on the 4th floor near the server room. He came in early, 6:45 before most of the staff arrived, and walked the floor. He had done this in the military, the practice of physically moving through a space before you had to operate in it, not looking for anything specific, just building the picture. The way light came in, where people had put personal items on their desks, which indicated how settled they felt, where the dead zones were, the spaces that never quite got used because the flow of the place didn't move people through them naturally. The Chicago branch occupied 2 full floors with an additional partial floor for warehouse coordination and dispatch. There were 112 people based here, not counting the warehouse and distribution staff who technically reported through a separate operational chain, but whose daily work was entirely integrated with what happened in this office. The 4th floor, where Ethan had worked as an analyst, showed all the signs Claire had described. The desks were neat in a way that communicated nothing personal. A few plants, but even those had the slightly neglected look of things people kept watering out of obligation rather than care. The common areas were clean and sparse. There was a whiteboard near the break room that had a motivational quote written on it in Victor's handwriting that had been there, as far as Ethan could tell from the marker oxidization, for at least 2 months. Nobody had added to it. Nobody had erased it. It just existed, like a flag that had been planted and quietly abandoned. He erased it and left the whiteboard blank. By 8 o'clock, the first staff were arriving, and Ethan positioned himself near the main elevator bank, not blocking it, not making a performance of his presence, just there, in the space where people moved through in the morning. He said good morning to people when they came in, used names where he remembered them, and he remembered most of them. That was something the Navy had trained hard, the operational necessity of knowing who you were working with. Some people were visibly confused. A few were wary. Carla Diaz from Logistics Coordination, a woman in her early 40s who had been at the Chicago branch for 8 years, and had survived Victor's tenure with the particular endurance of someone who had decided not to let one man's damage define her entire career, stopped when she saw him. "Carter," she said, "what are you... I heard you were let go." "I was," he said. "Situation changed." She looked at him with the direct, slightly skeptical assessment of someone who had seen situations change before and was withholding judgment on whether this change was better or worse than the last one. "Victor's people are saying he's on administrative leave. Victor won't be coming back." The hallway was not empty. 3 other people in earshot. Ethan had chosen his words deliberately. Not a dramatic announcement, just a factual statement, delivered at normal conversational volume. He watched it move through the people nearby, a slight loosening around the eyes, a breath that had been held partway out for months finally completing itself. "So who's running things?" Carla said. "I am. Interim." He paused. "I'd like to sit down with you and your team this week. I want to understand what's actually been happening with the Memphis routing issues. I know you've had problems with the transfer protocol, and I know they've been reported and ignored. I want to hear about it from the people who've been dealing with it." Carla was quiet for a moment. The wariness hadn't disappeared. It had changed character, shifting from the reflexive caution of someone in a bad environment into something more considered, the careful interest of someone deciding whether to believe in something. "All right," she said. "Wednesday?" "Wednesday," he said. He spent the first 2 days listening more than talking. He scheduled 30-minute one-on-ones with team leads and senior analysts, not to assess them, or not only to assess them, but to hear what they had stopped saying in meetings, what they'd submitted in internal reports that had gone nowhere, what they had quietly fixed themselves because going through official channels had taught them the request would either stall or come back to them as a problem. What he heard was layered. There was the operational damage, the concrete fixable problems with systems and protocols, and vendor relationships that had been allowed to degrade because Victor's performance management was almost entirely focused on making the numbers look right, rather than making the operation run right. That was actually the easier part. Broken processes could be repaired. Misaligned incentives could be restructured. The harder part was what it had done to the people. He heard it most clearly in a conversation with a young analyst named Marcus Webb, 26, sharp, the kind of person who had come into the job 2 years ago with ideas and energy and had spent the subsequent time very carefully learning when to apply those things and when to keep them invisible. Marcus sat across from Ethan in the small conference room they were using for the one-on-ones and answered questions with precise, complete, carefully bounded answers. No volunteering, no elaboration beyond what was asked. Ethan recognized the pattern immediately. It was the pattern of someone who had been punished for enthusiasm. "I've read your internal memos," Ethan said. Marcus went slightly still. "The ones you submitted last year about the inventory management system. Those were... I was still new to how things worked here. I didn't have full context." "You had plenty of context. The system was generating false positive error flags on the Chicago to Indianapolis transfers, which meant your team was spending about 4 hours a week manually verifying shipments that should have been auto-confirmed." Ethan kept his voice level. "You identified the problem correctly, you proposed a fix, and the memo went nowhere." Marcus was watching him with the expression of someone who had been prepared for a different kind of conversation. "Mr. Hale said the issues were overstated." "They weren't." A beat. "No," Marcus said. "They weren't." "I want you to send me the original memo," Ethan said. "Updated with anything that's changed in the system since you wrote it. I want to look at getting that fix actually implemented." Marcus looked at him for a moment in the specific silence of someone deciding whether to let themselves believe in something. "Okay," he said finally, then quieter. "There's also a secondary issue with the dispatch scheduling software that I documented about 6 months ago. If you want, I can include that too." "Yeah," Ethan said, "include that." He came home Tuesday night tired in a way that was different from the tired he'd carried through 18 months as an analyst. That had been the fatigue of compression, the energy cost of working within a space that was too small for what you could actually see and do. This was the straightforward exhaustion of using everything you had, and it sat differently in his body. Emma was already in bed when he got in. He checked on her, saw the foxes on her pajamas and the same cross-armed sleeping posture she'd had since she was a toddler, and stood in her doorway for a moment. He thought about the 230 jobs, thought about Carla Diaz's 8 years in that building, thought about Marcus Webb's carefully bounded answers and the memo that had gone nowhere. 14 weeks. Claire arrived in Chicago on Thursday morning. She came without announcement, not to him anyway. He knew she was coming because she'd texted him Wednesday night, "In Chicago tomorrow. Thought I'd come see the space. 10 o'clock work?" He had replied, "Works. Park on the west side, east garage runs slow." She arrived at 10 past 10 wearing a dark coat and carrying a leather bag, her hair down, which was different from the boardroom. She came through the main entrance on the 3rd floor like someone who walked into buildings they owned on a regular basis, which Ethan reflected she did, and he met her in the lobby. "You look like you've been here for a week," she said, looking at him. "It's been 4 days." "Same thing." She looked around the lobby, at the Meridian signage, the reception desk, the people moving through with the slightly different quality of movement he had already noticed, the incremental change in how people held themselves when they weren't anticipating something bad. "It's different in here." 4 days is not a lot of time to change much. "No," she agreed. "But something's different." He took her through the floors. Not a formal tour. She didn't need one. She'd spent 10 days here in a cleaning uniform. But a walkthrough, the two of them moving through the space while he talked about what he'd learned in the one-on-ones, what the operational priorities were, where he thought the quickest recoverable ground was. She asked sharp questions, the kind that went directly to the variables he was least certain about, which he found simultaneously useful and slightly annoying, and which told him that she had been thinking about the Chicago problem for considerably longer than the past week. They ended up in the small conference room on the 4th floor with coffee and the printed version of the recovery framework he'd sketched out. It wasn't polished. He told her it wouldn't be polished, that he was still gathering information, but it had a shape. She studied it. He watched her read, which was a thing he had started doing without entirely meaning to. Watching how she processed information, the small signals in her expression when she hit something that surprised her or confirmed something she'd already suspected. "The vendor contracts," she said. "You're recommending we renegotiate 3 of the 5 flagged ones rather than terminate." "The ones I'm recommending we keep have existing relationships with our Memphis and Indianapolis hubs. Terminating them creates a gap we can't fill fast enough in the short window. Renegotiation gets us better terms and keeps the operational continuity." "Who handles the renegotiation?" "I will," he said. "With Carla Diaz. She knows those contracts better than anyone in this building, and she's been watching the leverage points for 2 years. She's been waiting for someone to let her use them." Claire made a note on her tablet. "I want to meet her." "I'll set it up." He leaned back. "You said you wanted to see how I assess people." "I do." "Then you should know that the first thing I did when I walked in Monday morning was read everything that had been reported through official channels in the past 18 months that didn't result in any action. Because the most useful information in a broken organization is almost never the stuff that made it into the official record. It's the stuff that got filed and ignored." She looked up from her tablet. "Is that a SEAL thing?" "It's a paying attention thing." He met her eyes. "The people in this office have been solving problems quietly for years because it was safer than asking for help. They're good at it. That's actually a thing we can work with. They have the skills, they just need to not be punished for using them." Claire was quiet for a moment in the way she went quiet when she was working through something. He had started to map the different qualities of her silence, the one that meant she was calculating, the one that meant she was deciding whether to say what she was actually thinking, the one that was just her being present in a room without needing to fill it. This was the second kind. "You know what Victor's biggest failure was?" she said. "Which one?" The corner of her mouth moved. "His biggest failure was that he spent 4 years in this building and never figured out who these people were. He had a floor full of people who were capable of fixing his problems, and he spent all his time making sure they were too afraid to try." Ethan thought of Marcus Webb's careful, bounded answers, the memo that had gone nowhere, Carla Diaz's 8 years of endurance. "Yeah," he said. They sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "How's your daughter?" The shift caught him slightly off guard. Not the question itself, but the timing of it, the naturalness of it, as though it was a logical continuation of the conversation rather than a change of subject. "She's good," he said. "She's been asking me every morning if my new job is still real." "What do you tell her?" "I tell her it's still real." "Is that what you believe?" He looked at her directly. "Yes." She held his gaze for a beat. "Good," she said. And then she looked back at the recovery framework, and they went back to work. But something had shifted in the room. A small thing, barely nameable, the way temperature shifts when a window is opened somewhere in a building, a change in the air that you feel before you can explain it. Outside, Chicago was doing what Chicago did in early winter, pressing cold and gray against every window, the lake driving weather into the streets, people moving fast on the sidewalks below with their shoulders up and their heads down. In the conference room on the 4th floor, 2 people who had met in a service corridor over a spilled mop bucket were working through a spreadsheet together, and the $20 bill was in the inside pocket of Claire Morgan's leather bag, because she had put it there before she left Cincinnati and hadn't decided what to do with it yet. That was the part she hadn't told him, that she carried it. She wasn't ready to examine why. The first 3 weeks were the hardest, not because the work was unclear. Ethan had operated in environments with far less information and far higher stakes, and the mechanics of organizational repair, while genuinely complex, were at least visible in ways that certain other kinds of problems weren't. You could look at a broken process and trace it back to its point of failure. You could read an employment record and understand something about the pattern of decisions that produced it. The problems in the Chicago branch were real and substantial, but they were the kind that yielded to attention and time. What made the first 3 weeks hard was the human dimension of it, specifically the speed at which people who had been conditioned to expect the worst would allow themselves to expect something different. He noticed it in small moments, A team lead named Renata Flores, who had been with the company for 6 years, started contributing in the Monday morning operations meeting during the second week, cautiously at first, framing her observations as questions rather than statements, the grammatical hedge of someone testing whether saying the obvious thing out loud was going to cost her anything. Ethan answered the substance of what she said and asked a follow-up question, and she sat with that for a second like a person recalibrating, and then the following week she came in with notes. Marcus Webb sent him the updated inventory management memo on a Friday afternoon with a note that said, almost apologetically, I added the dispatch scheduling section and also a third issue I noticed last month that I hadn't formally written up yet. Let me know if this is too much. Ethan had read it over the weekend and sent back 3 specific questions and the phrase, this is exactly what I need, and on Monday, Marcus had arrived 20 minutes early and was already at his desk when Ethan came in, which had not previously been Marcus's habit. These were small things. He knew they were small things, but he also knew that organizations were essentially made of small things repeated at scale, and the direction those small things were moving in told you something true about the direction the whole structure was moving. He reported all of it to Claire. Honestly, the way she had asked him to. Not spinning the positives, not downplaying the problems, just an accurate accounting of where things stood each week. He sent the reports Thursday nights, and she usually responded by Friday afternoon with a few questions and occasionally a piece of context about the board situation or the wider company picture that helped him understand why something he was working on mattered in ways that weren't immediately visible from the Chicago level. It was good working communication, clean, efficient, the kind where both people understood what they were doing and trusted each other to be straight about it. And then there was the other part of it, which was less clean and less easy to categorize. She came to Chicago every week, sometimes twice. She had told him she'd be in regularly, and she'd meant it, but the regularity of it still caught him slightly off guard each time. The text the night before, the arrival mid-morning, the hours they spent in the conference room on the 4th floor, going through data and recovery projections and personnel questions with a focus and a directness that he found, if he was being honest with himself, genuinely energizing in a way that went somewhat beyond the professional satisfaction of working a difficult problem with someone competent. He didn't examine that particularly closely. He was 32 years old with a recovering branch office and a sick kid and 14 weeks on a clock, and examining it closely was a thing that would cost him attention he needed somewhere else. But it was there. Like a frequency underneath everything else, audible if you listened for it. On a Tuesday afternoon in week 4, they were working through the vendor renegotiation results. Carla Diaz had been formidable in the contract conversations, exactly as Ethan had predicted, deploying 2 years of accumulated knowledge about leverage points with the focused efficiency of someone who had been waiting for permission to be useful. When Claire's phone buzzed on the table between them, she glanced at it. Something in her face shifted, a tightening around the eyes that was brief and controlled and would probably have been invisible to most people. She picked up the phone and stepped to the far end of the conference room. Marcus? A pause. When? Another pause, longer. No, I'll handle it. Don't respond to anything until I call you back. She hung up, stood at the window for a moment with the city behind her and the phone in her hand, her back to him. Problem? He said. She turned. Victor filed a wrongful termination claim this morning. Ethan set his pen down. He's alleging that the termination was retaliatory, she said, that the evidence against him was fabricated or mischaracterized, and that his dismissal was part of a broader effort to consolidate executive authority at the regional level. She said this with the flat precision of someone who had already heard this argument and identified every place it was wrong. His attorney is claiming the undercover operation was an invasion of privacy and that anything gathered during it is inadmissible as the basis for a personnel decision. Is that a legitimate legal argument? Possibly. She crossed back to the table and sat down. Her posture was the same as it always was, straight, composed, the physical expression of someone who didn't let uncertainty take up visible space. But there was something else underneath it today. The privacy question is genuinely complicated. I had legal review the operation before I started, but undercover investigations of this kind exist in a gray area, depending on how they're characterized. What does your legal team say? That we have a strong position on the documented financial irregularities, because those are supported by records that have nothing to do with the undercover work. The harder piece is the behavioral documentation, the hostile work environment pattern, the intimidation. She paused. A lot of that comes from what I personally witnessed. And you're the CEO, which makes you a witness with obvious interest in the outcome. Yes, Ethan thought. What about the employees, the ones who experienced it directly? They'd have to be willing to make statements, formally, on the record. She met his eyes, which, given the environment Victor built in this office, is not something people are going to do lightly. That was the heart of it. Victor had spent 4 years constructing a workplace where speaking up had predictable and unpleasant consequences. Even with him gone, even with the daily reality of the office already shifting towards something different, asking people who had learned to protect themselves by staying quiet to now put their names on formal statements about the person who had taught them to stay quiet. That was a significant ask. I'm not going to pressure anyone, Ethan said. I'm not asking you to. But I can talk to people, individually, informally. Let them know what's happening and what their options are. Not from a position of authority. Off the clock, outside the building, if that's better. He paused. They deserve to know there's a process available to them. She looked at him for a moment. That's not a small thing to do. Victor used this office for 4 years. If he gets this claim through, it sends a specific message to everyone in this building about what happens when you document abuse. He kept his voice even. I'd rather they heard a different message. She held his gaze for a beat longer than she needed to. Okay, she said. How much time do we have? The initial response is due in 2 weeks. If we're going to counter with employee statements, we'd want them before then. I'll start tomorrow. He did. What followed was 2 weeks that ran alongside the operational recovery work like a parallel river, present, demanding, requiring a completely different set of skills. He talked to 14 people over the course of 9 days. He did it the way he'd said he would. Informally, off the clock, at a coffee shop 3 blocks from the office where the lighting was bad and the tables were small and nobody from work was likely to see them. He explained the claim. He explained what a formal statement would involve and what it would not involve. He made it clear, each time, that there was no professional consequence to saying no. Most of them needed time. A few said no immediately, politely, with the particular regret of people who had drawn their line of self-protection at a specific distance and weren't moving it. He respected that. He said so, each time, and meant it. 7 people said yes. 7 people, including Carla Diaz and Marcus Webb, and a warehouse coordinator named Joel Tron, who had transferred in from the Indianapolis hub 14 months ago and had sent a resignation letter to his previous manager 3 weeks after arriving that said simply, "It's not what I expected here." Sat down with Claire's legal team and described, on the record, what working under Victor Hale had been like. Ethan was not present for any of those conversations. He had done his part and stepped back because it wasn't his story to be present for. It was theirs. He heard from Claire's legal team that the statements were, collectively, detailed and consistent and damning in the specific way that first-hand accounts are damning when they come from multiple people who have no connection to each other except shared experience. He heard, a week later, that Victor Hale's attorney had reached out to discuss settlement terms. He told Ethan in a text message at 8:30 on a Wednesday morning. Attorney withdrew the wrongful termination claim this morning. 7 statements was enough. He was in his car in the parking garage when he read it. He sat with it for a moment, the particular quiet of a thing finally settling into place after a long time held in suspension. Then he typed back, "Good. How are you?" A pause. Then, "Tired. You? Same. Coffee when you're in next?" Another pause, slightly longer than it needed to be. "Thursday. I'll bring better coffee than whatever's in that break room." He put his phone in his pocket and went upstairs. Week 7 brought the first real evidence that the recovery trajectory was holding. The Memphis to Chicago transfer protocol fix, Marcus Webb's original proposal, updated and finally implemented, had been running for 3 weeks and was producing exactly the results Marcus had projected 18 months ago when he first wrote the memo that went nowhere. The false positive error rate had dropped by 68%. The 4 hours a week Carla's team had been spending on manual verification had been recovered and redirected. Not a dramatic number in isolation, but compounded across the other operational improvements Ethan had been working through, the cumulative picture was starting to look like something. He sent Claire the Week 7 report on Thursday night with a note at the bottom. Numbers are moving in the right direction. Still a lot of runway to cover, but the trajectory is real. She responded at 11:40 p.m. I can see that. Board meeting is in 7 weeks. This is the difference between a conversation and an argument. Good work. He read it sitting at his kitchen table after Emma was in bed, the house quiet, a mug of tea going cold beside him. He thought about the word she'd used, work, and how much weight it could carry when it was applied by someone who understood what the work actually was. He also thought about 11:40 p.m. He wondered if she was at her desk in Cincinnati. He wondered what her apartment looked like, whether it was the kind of place that reflected her or the kind of place that had been furnished to reflect a role. He finished his tea and went to bed. She came to Chicago on Thursday with the better coffee, an insulated carrier from a place near her hotel, 2 cups, with the particular thoughtfulness of someone who had actually remembered what he drank. They sat in his office. It was his office now, not Victor's old one. He had claimed a smaller room on the 3rd floor and left the regional director's corner office empty because something about using it felt like inheriting a set of wrong assumptions, with the Week 8 data spread across his desk. The board's biggest concern, she said, is whether this is sustainable. They've seen turnarounds before that looked good at 2 months and fell apart at 6. What do you tell them? I tell them the difference is whether the underlying operation was fixed or just the surface numbers. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. With Victor, it was always the surface. He was a gifted surface manager. The underlying operation is being fixed, Ethan said. Slowly. But that's what slow actually looks like. It's real instead of manufactured. I know that. She looked at him. I need to be able to show them why they should believe it. Bring them here. She raised an eyebrow. Not a dog and pony show, he said. Not a prepared presentation with good lighting. Bring them here and walk the floor. Let them talk to the team leads. Let them see Marcus Webb explain the inventory system fix in his own words. Let them sit in on an actual operations meeting. He paused. The most convincing thing I can show the board is people who are doing their jobs because they understand why the job matters. That's not something you can fake for a 2-hour visit. Claire was quiet, looking at the data on his desk. He watched her think, the particular stillness of it, the way her focus narrowed when she was taking something seriously. That's risky, she said finally. Most honest things are. She looked up at him. The late afternoon light was coming through the window at a low angle, the way it did in October in Chicago when the sun was already thinking about leaving earlier than it used to, and it caught the edge of her face in a way that made her look tired. Not depleted, just human, the way people look when they've been carrying something for a long time and are somewhere they don't feel the need to hide that. Can I ask you something? She said. Yeah. What made you stay? In the first place. When Victor fired you and you walked out of this building, you had the resume, you had the experience, you could have found another job. Why did you come back? He thought about the honest answer, not the polished version. I came back because you asked me to, and because the situation was one I could actually do something about. And I'm not built to walk away from that. He paused. And because 230 people were going to get hurt by a problem they didn't create. That matters to me. Even if you didn't know any of them? It mattered before I knew any of them. It matters more now. She was watching him with the expression he'd started to recognize as the one she wore when she was hearing something she needed to sit with. Not skeptical. She'd been past skepticism for a while now. But careful, the way you're careful with things that turn out to matter more than you expected them to. For the record, she said, the reason I asked you wasn't only strategic. He looked at her, waited. I told myself it was, she said. The personnel file, the competency evidence, the logical case for why you were the right person for this. I told myself the story very convincingly. A pause. But you gave a stranger $20 in a hallway when you'd just been fired, and I carried that bill from Chicago to Cincinnati and back again, and I don't think I was doing that because of your operational metrics." The office was quiet. Outside, the building's ventilation ran its steady hum, and somewhere on the floor a phone rang twice and stopped. Ethan looked at her. At the tiredness in her face and the directness in her eyes, and the way she had just said a true thing without performing it, without managing how it landed. "I know," he said. "Does that complicate things?" "Probably." "Is that going to be a problem?" He thought about it seriously, the way the question deserved. "Not for the work," he said. "The work is real regardless. The branch needs what it needs, and I know how to provide it, and that's separate from everything else." "And the everything else?" He held her gaze. "The everything else needs to wait 7 weeks." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, not conceding, not disappointed, just accepting the shape of things with the pragmatism of someone who knew what it meant to put work ahead of something else, and who understood that this particular delay didn't mean the thing went away. 7 weeks, she said, after the board meeting. After the board meeting. She picked up her coffee. "I'm holding you to that." "I'd expect you to." They went back to the data. But the clean separation he'd proposed didn't hold perfectly, because things that are real don't stay in their designated compartments. The following Tuesday, Emma had a kidney flare. It wasn't the worst one she'd had. The worst was when she was 4, before the diagnosis was fully established, before they knew exactly what they were managing. But it was bad enough. He got the call from her school at 11:15 a.m., that particular school nurse tone that was calm and specific in a way designed to relay urgency without triggering panic in the receiving parent. Emma had been taken to the nurse's office. Her pain was a 6. Could he come? He was in his car in 4 minutes. The clinic visit took 3 hours. The attending physician adjusted her medication dosage, ran 2 additional tests, and sent them home with instructions and a follow-up appointment scheduled for Friday. Emma, for her part, handled the clinic with the particular exhausted stoicism of a child who had been through this enough times to know the protocol, which was somehow harder to watch than if she'd been frightened. In the car on the way home, she was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I hate when it does that." "I know, baby. It's not fair." "No," he said. "It's not." She looked out the window. "Are you going to miss a lot of work?" The question landed in him somewhere specific and uncomfortable. 7 years old, and she was already calculating what her medical needs cost him. He didn't know when she had learned to do that, and he didn't like that she had. "Don't worry about that," he said. "I'm not worried. I'm just asking." "The answer is that you're more important than work. That's always been the answer, and it's not going to change." She was quiet for a moment, then, "Mrs. Patterson says you work too hard." "Mrs. Patterson says that a lot." "She's probably right." He glanced at her in the mirror. She was looking out the window with her arms folded across her stomach the way she held herself when she hurt, a posture he had memorized through too many nights and clinic waiting rooms and long drives home. "We're going to stop and get soup on the way home," he said. "The kind from that place you like." "The one with the bread?" "The one with the bread." She settled back against the seat. "Okay?" He texted Claire from the parking lot of the soup place while Emma was in the passenger seat with her eyes closed. "Family thing today? Out of the office. I'll catch up on the afternoon reports tonight." Her response came while he was still looking at his phone. "Don't worry about the reports. Is everything okay?" He hesitated a moment, then typed, "Emma had a kidney flare. She's okay. Clinic says it's manageable. Just a day." A longer pause than her usual response time. Then, "I'm sorry. Give her something from me. Not chocolate. You probably shouldn't give a kid with kidney issues candy from a stranger. Just tell her someone's thinking about her." He read it twice. "You probably shouldn't give a kid with kidney issues candy from a stranger." The awareness in it, the fact that she had heard enough about Emma's condition in passing conversations to know that there were dietary considerations, and had remembered and had made a small self-correcting joke about it. That kind of attention was not accidental. He typed back, "I'll tell her. Thank you." She sent back, "Go home. The branch will still be broken tomorrow." He went home. That night, With Emma asleep with her heating pad and her medication adjusted and the follow-up appointment in the calendar, Ethan sat in the kitchen and caught up on the afternoon reports. He worked until midnight, steady and focused, and then he sat for a while longer with the kitchen light on and the house quiet around him. He thought about 14 weeks being 7 weeks from over. He thought about the board coming to Chicago. He'd heard back from Claire's assistant that she was seriously considering it, and about Carla's vendor renegotiation closing out the last of the 5 contracts this week, and about the operational metrics report due at the end of the month that was going to show, for the first time since Victor had taken the regional director position, a genuine performance picture instead of a managed one. He thought about a woman in a corner office in Cincinnati carrying a $20 bill in the inside pocket of her bag, not entirely sure why. He thought, 7 weeks. Then he turned off the kitchen light and went to bed because the work started again tomorrow, and he needed to be ready for it. Week 10 arrived with the complication he hadn't fully prepared for. It came in the form of a phone call from the board, not through Claire, directly to him, which was itself a signal. A board member named Gerald Stanhope, late 60s, the kind of voice that had been making large decisions for a long time and had settled into the confidence of someone who no longer second-guessed his instincts, called Ethan on a Thursday afternoon. "I've been looking at the Chicago numbers," Stanhope said without preamble. "Ms. Morgan has been keeping us updated, but I wanted to hear directly from the man running the operation." "I appreciate the call," Ethan said. He was standing at his office window watching the street below, the late October foot traffic of people wrapped in coats against a wind that was getting serious. "What would you like to know?" "I want to know if you believe in what you're showing me." Ethan paused. Meaning I've seen a lot of recovery plans in my time. I've seen a lot of people stand in front of a board and tell me a story about trajectory and potential. I've also seen most of those stories fall apart at the 6-month mark because the fundamentals weren't actually fixed, just reframed. A pause. "Ms. Morgan vouches for you personally. In my experience, when she vouches for someone personally, it means something different than when she vouches for a plan. So I'm asking you directly, do you believe in what you're showing us?" Ethan looked at the street. A woman was trying to flag a cab in the wind, her coat pulled tight, her hair going sideways. Something about the ordinary persistence of it, the sheer mundaneness of standing on a sidewalk trying to get home while the weather argued with you, felt like the right thing to be looking at while he answered this question. "Yes," he said, "I believe in it because I know the difference between what was here when I came in and what's here now, and the difference is real. I can show you the systems that were broken and the current state of those systems. I can show you the people who are functioning in a suppression environment and what they're producing now that they're not. Those aren't projections. They're measurements of things that have already happened." "And the next 4 weeks?" "The next 4 weeks are about closing out the vendor restructuring and getting the Q4 inventory positioned correctly. If those land where I expect them to land, the quarterly presentation to the board will show a branch that is genuinely performing, not a branch that has been made to look like it's performing." A long pause on Stanhope's end. "Ms. Morgan said you'd say something like that," he said. "Did she?" "She said you were the kind of person who understood the difference between actual and manufactured. She seemed to consider that relatively rare." Another pause. "She also said I should come to Chicago instead of waiting for a report." "She's right about that," Ethan said. "Come see the place." "I'll be there next week," Stanhope said. "Thursday. I'd like to meet the team." "They'll be ready," Ethan said, and then, "Not prepared. Ready. Those are different things." Stanhope made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Ms. Morgan said you'd say that too." After the call ended, Ethan stood at the window for another minute. The woman with the coat had gotten her cab. The sidewalk had moved on, absorbed her departure into its ongoing current of ordinary movement. He thought about Claire telling a board member what he would say before he said it, and about what it meant that she had been that accurate, and about the particular kind of attention it took to know someone's patterns that well in a relatively short time. He texted her. "Stanhope called. 3 minutes later, I know. He told me he was going to. You told him I'd say the thing about actual versus manufactured. Did I get it wrong?" He looked at his phone. Then he typed, "No." Her reply came back almost immediately. I didn't think so. He pocketed his phone and went back to his desk, and the afternoon moved forward the way afternoons do when there's still a great deal of work left inside them. Ordinary and essential and full of the small, unremarkable decisions that built towards something larger than any of them looked like from the inside. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows of the fourth floor, and the branch moved through another day of its slow, real, unmistakable recovery. Gerald Stanhope arrived on a Thursday morning in the first week of November without an entourage. Ethan had half expected the board visit to come with the full apparatus of executive oversight, assistants, prepared agendas, the careful choreography of people who wanted to see a thing while also controlling what they saw. Stanhope came alone, in a dark coat that was starting to show its age at the collar, carrying a briefcase that looked like it had been with him for 20 years and was not going to be replaced on any timetable he'd imposed on himself. He shook Ethan's hand in the lobby with the grip of a man who still considered that a meaningful gesture, looked around the entrance of the building the way you look at a place you're trying to form a real opinion about, and said, "Show me what you've got." So Ethan showed him. Not the polished version, the actual version, which meant starting on the loading dock, where Joel Tran was running the morning dispatch with the kind of specific, unruffled authority that comes from someone who has genuinely internalized a system rather than performing competency over the top of confusion. Joel didn't know the board was visiting. Ethan had told no one except Carla, and his natural working mode was exactly what Ethan needed Stanhope to see, a man doing a hard job well because he understood why it mattered, not because someone was watching. They moved through the warehouse floor, up through the coordinator level, and eventually to the fourth floor where the analysts worked. Marcus Webb was at his desk with 3 screens open and the inventory system running, cross-checking the Indianapolis transfer confirmation against the auto-verified manifest that 18 months ago would have required 4 hours of manual labor. Stanhope stopped behind Marcus and watched the screen for a moment. "That's the new protocol?" Marcus turned, registered the older man in the good coat, the general atmosphere of someone who asked questions that mattered. "Yes, sir. The system was generating false positives on the transfer confirmations. We identified the error source in the validation algorithm and corrected it about 3 weeks ago." He paused. "It saved us roughly 4 work hours per week on manual verification across the team." "Who identified it?" "I did originally, about 18 months ago." Marcus said it without inflection. Not bitter, not proud, just factual. "Mr. Carter got it implemented." Stanhope looked at Ethan. Ethan said nothing. They kept moving. Carla was waiting for them in the third-floor conference room with the vendor contract summary and the Q4 positioning document spread across the table. She had dressed for the meeting, not formally, but intentionally. And she walked Stanhope through the vendor renegotiation results with the calm authority of someone who had been doing the work for years and had finally been given a room to present it in correctly. The numbers were what they were. Stanhope did not perform enthusiasm or skepticism. He read, he asked precise questions, and he listened to the answers with the full attention of someone who understood that the answers to precise questions told you more than the original presentation. After an hour and 40 minutes, he closed the folder in front of him. "The Indianapolis hub consolidation was on the table," he said. "You know that." "I know," Ethan said. 230 jobs. 233 as of last month. We brought on 3 additional coordinators for the Q4 surge. Stanhope looked at him. "You added headcount." "The volume warranted it. The branch is producing enough to support it." A pause. "I wasn't going to make a different call because the board had a consolidation plan in the drawer." The room was quiet for a moment. Carla was very still beside Ethan, her hands flat on the table. "No," Stanhope said finally. "I wouldn't expect you to." He picked up his briefcase. "The board meets in 3 weeks. I'll have reviewed everything by then. I can tell you informally, and I want to be clear this is informal, that what I've seen today makes the consolidation argument considerably harder to sustain." He stood, shook Ethan's hand, then Carla's. At the door, he paused. "Miss Morgan has been doing this for 11 years. I've watched her make a lot of judgment calls. This one..." He looked at Ethan for a moment. "This one was different." Then he left. Carla let out a long, slow breath. "Was that good?" "Yeah," Ethan said. "That was good." Claire called that evening at 7:30, while Ethan was helping Emma with a project about weather systems that involved a significant amount of cotton balls and blue construction paper. He stepped into the hallway. "He called you?" 20 minutes ago, she said. "He told me the consolidation argument was hard to sustain. Coming from Stanhope, that's roughly equivalent to anyone else saying the decision is made." Ethan leaned against the hallway wall. From the kitchen came the sound of Emma talking to herself about clouds, a running commentary she apparently needed to produce in order to think, and the small ripping sound of cotton being pulled apart. "The branch is going to make it," he said. "The branch is going to make it," Claire confirmed. Her voice was even, but there was something underneath it that was not evenness. A quiet weight of relief that had been held compressed for weeks and was now very carefully releasing. "Ethan." "Yeah." "Thank you." He didn't have a ready answer for that. Not because he didn't feel anything. He felt some blessings. He felt something specific and real, the particular satisfaction of a job done correctly, of people protected who hadn't asked to be protected, of a thing that had been broken and was now, demonstrably, not broken anymore. But gratitude from her landed differently than he'd expected, because he knew enough about her by now to understand that she didn't offer it easily or automatically. "You hired the right person," he said finally. "I know I did." A pause. "The board meeting is in 3 weeks. I know." "And after that," he said. A moment of quiet between them that was not uncomfortable. Outside his kitchen window, the early November dark had settled over the neighborhood, the streetlights making circles on the wet pavement, and his daughter was in the next room dismantling cotton balls and describing the water cycle to no one in particular. 3 weeks, Claire said. 3 weeks. Che. The board meeting was on a Thursday in Cincinnati, in the same building where he had sat across from Claire and understood who she was for the first time. He wasn't in the meeting, it wasn't his room, it was hers, but she had asked him to be in Cincinnati that day, available if questions needed answering, which was a way of saying she wanted him nearby, which was something he had permitted himself to understand and had not over-examined. He sat in a coffee shop 2 blocks from the headquarters building for 3 hours with his laptop and a succession of cups of coffee that he drank more out of occupation than thirst, working through the operational plan for the next quarter, the one that assumed the branch survived and continued and needed a genuine forward strategy rather than a recovery triage. She texted him at 11:47. Done. Chicago stands. No consolidation. He set down his cup. Then, come up? He walked to the building and rode the elevator to the 34th floor. Dana Reyes waved him through without the visitor badge this time, which he noticed and filed. Claire was at her desk when he came in, her jacket off, her hair slightly less composed than usual, the look of someone who had been in an intense room for 3 hours and had come out the other side of it. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway. "Hey," she said. "Hey." "Sit down. I have to tell you something before I forget the exact words." He sat in the chair across from her desk, the CEO's desk, which was less imposing than he'd expected it to be, functional and covered with the organized density of someone who processed a lot of information and needed it accessible. Stanhope said during the meeting that the Chicago recovery was the clearest demonstration he'd seen in recent years of the difference between managing numbers and managing people. She said it carefully, the way you repeat something when you want the other person to receive the exact words. He said it almost like an aside, but the room heard it. She looked at Ethan. "You know what the funny thing is?" "What?" "He said it while he was looking at me. Not about you. About me. About the decision to send you in." She paused. "I think he was telling me that I got it right." Ethan considered this. "Did that surprise you?" "Getting it right doesn't always feel like getting it right while it's happening," she said. "You're in it. You're making calls. You're second-guessing the parts you can't control. It mostly just feels like a lot of sustained uncertainty." She leaned back in her chair. Hearing someone say it out loud, in a room where it mattered, yeah, it surprised me a little. He nodded. He understood that. He had felt the same thing standing on the loading dock watching Joel Tran run dispatch without knowing anyone important was watching. The particular confirmation of something you'd believed but hadn't been certain about until you saw it working. The board approved the Chicago operating budget for next fiscal year, she said. Full allocation. They're treating it as an independent branch with a performance track record rather than a liability with a question mark attached. That's what it is. I know. She looked at him steadily. Your interim term ended at the board meeting. He met her eyes. I'm aware. I'd like to offer you the permanent position, Regional Operations Director, Chicago Branch, with a compensation package that reflects the permanent role rather than the interim one. She paused. I'm also going to tell you that the permanent role comes with different terms than the interim, and one of those terms is that the question of whether this, she moved her hand slightly in the space between them, is going to be a thing we talk about or a thing we don't talk about becomes relevant in a way it wasn't before. Because the interim was a crisis, and the permanent isn't. Because the interim was a crisis and the permanent isn't, she agreed. And because I've been thinking about it for several weeks, and I'm not particularly good at pretending I haven't been. The 34th floor had the hum of a building doing its business around them. Distant phones, the ventilation system, the low-frequency presence of a large organization in motion. Outside the windows, Cincinnati was doing its ordinary Thursday, unmoved by and unaware of anything happening in this particular room. Ethan thought about what it meant to answer this honestly. Not the polished version, the actual version, which was that he had been thinking about it too, that he had been careful about it, because careful was the right approach when the situation required a particular clarity of purpose, and that the situation had now changed in the specific way she was describing. I want the permanent position, he said. That's a separate and uncomplicated answer. And the other thing? The other thing is also something I want, he said. And I've been waiting until I could say it without the conflict of interest attached to it. She looked at him for a long moment, really looked, the way she had looked at him in a service corridor on a late Wednesday night when a mop bucket was on the floor and the building was almost empty, and neither of them was yet who the other knew them to be. The conflict of interest is still there, she said. Technically. I know. I own the company you work for. I'm aware. That's a complicated dynamic that reasonable people would say requires careful management. Reasonable people would be right. He held her gaze. Do you want to be reasonable people about it, or do you want to figure out how to manage it? A pause. Then the thing that came before her smile arrived, and then the smile itself, real, slightly reluctant, the smile of someone who had been carrying a composed exterior for a long time and was putting some of it down. I've been told I'm very good at managing complicated dynamics, she said. I've seen the evidence of that firsthand. She reached into her desk drawer and set something on the desk between them, the $20 bill. He looked at it, the torn edge, the particular fold lines from being carried in the inside pocket of a leather bag for weeks. I've been thinking about what to do with this, she said. I can't give it back to you. That's not what it was for. I can't frame it or make a thing of it. That seems like the wrong tone. She looked at it. I've just been carrying it. Because it was easier than deciding. Because it was easier than deciding. She looked up. I'm deciding now. What are you deciding? That it stays on my desk, she said. Not framed, not made into anything, just there, where I can see it. She paused. Because I think what it means is that the most important things that have ever happened in my professional life started with a person making a decision in a hallway when nobody who mattered was watching. And I don't want to forget that. Ethan looked at the bill on the desk. He thought about that Wednesday night, the held breath quiet of the office, the sound of Victor's voice in the corridor, the half-second of calculation before he stepped forward. He had not known, when he stepped forward, that it would lead here. He had not weighed the possible outcomes against each other and selected the most favorable. He had just done the thing that the moment asked for and dealt with the consequences as they arrived. That was the truth of it, and the truth of it was both simpler and more complicated than any version of the story that tried to make it into something deliberate or strategic. He had stepped forward because that was who he was, and everything that followed had flowed from that one uncalculated choice the way rivers flow from their sources, not toward any predetermined destination, just following the shape of the land. I'll accept the permanent position, he said. She nodded, professional, composed. And dinner, he said. When you're in Chicago next. The composure held for exactly one beat before it didn't. Yeah, she said. Dinner. Grandma meet. He drove back to Chicago that afternoon with the signed permanent contract in his bag and called Mrs. Patterson from the highway to say he'd be home by 7. Emma was at the kitchen table when he came in, working on a book report with the focused aggression she brought to assignments she found tedious. She looked up when he came through the door. How was Cincinnati? Good. He hung his coat. Really good, actually. She studied him with that 7-year-old accuracy he had given up trying to deflect. You look different. Different how? She thought about it, head tilted, the colored pencil still in her hand. Like when something you were worried about stopped being something to worry about. He looked at his daughter, at the foxes on her pajama top that she was still wearing at 6:30 in the evening, because he had a firm rule about changing for school and a somewhat looser position on everything else, at the book report she was suffering through, at the heating pad on the counter that she'd been using since the flare 2 weeks ago that was mostly resolved but still present at the edges, at the crayon drawing of the dog they still didn't have that was now stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like the state of Illinois. Yeah, he said, something like that. Is the new job definitely real now? The new job is definitely real now. She nodded, satisfied, and went back to her book report. After a moment, can we get a dog? No. Why not? Because we already have a complicated life. A dog would make it less complicated. That's not how dogs work. She made a sound of deep skepticism and returned to her report. He went to the kitchen and started making dinner. Pasta, something quick, the kind of meal that didn't require him to think very hard because he had used up a lot of thinking today, and what remained of the evening deserved to be simple. He stood at the stove and thought about 233 people who still had jobs. He thought about Carla Diaz, who had spent 8 years surviving something that would have broken people with less spine, and who had walked into a contract negotiation 3 weeks ago and been formidable in a way that had been waiting for permission for a long time. He thought about Marcus Webb and his memo that went nowhere for 18 months, and then went somewhere, and about Joel Tran on the loading dock running dispatch with the authority of someone who had finally been given the room to be exactly as good as he actually was. He thought about what it costs to work somewhere that treats you like furniture. Not the dramatic costs. Those were visible. Those showed up in exit interviews and turnover statistics and the kind of institutional damage that eventually becomes visible to board members. The quiet costs. The daily compression of operating in a space that has made it clear your judgment doesn't matter, your observations aren't wanted, your competence is either invisible or threatening, the energy it takes to show up anyway, what you have to put down in yourself to get through the day. He had been lucky. Not in the way people mean when they say lucky. Not undeserving of what happened, not the recipient of something given rather than earned. Lucky in the sense that the consequences of his choice had turned out differently than they might have. He had stepped forward in that corridor without knowing what it would cost, and without knowing what it would return, and it had returned something real and substantial and better than anything he would have designed for himself. But he thought about all the other hallways, all the other moments where someone saw something wrong and made the calculation he had made, weighing cost against conscience, measuring what they had to lose, and came down on the other side of it, not because they were cowards, because they were human, and humans protect what they have. And when you have barely enough, the risk of losing any of it is not abstract. That was the thing that stayed with him, that he thought about when the easy story of the past 3 months tried to simplify itself into something tidy. He had stepped forward in that hallway, and he was glad he had, and the outcome had been extraordinary. And none of that meant the risk had been smaller than it looked. The risk had been exactly as large as it looked. He had a daughter with a medical condition and a mortgage and no margin. He had known all of that when he stepped forward. The lesson wasn't that the right thing always works out. The lesson was that you had to do the right thing anyway and trust that you could handle the consequences, whatever they turned out to be. That the version of yourself who stood there and said nothing was a cost too. Not a visible one, not one that showed up on a balance sheet, but real. The thing you give up when you stay quiet in a hallway because staying quiet is safer is also something. It's not nothing. He had learned that in the Navy. You operated in the real world, not the one you wished for. And the real world's most stubborn feature was that it asked you questions at inconvenient times and expected answers on its own schedule. What kind of person are you? Not in the abstract, in the specific, in the corridor, right now, when no one who matters is watching. He still didn't have a tidy answer to that. He was 32 years old and imperfect in more ways than he could list on his best day. Impatient sometimes, not good enough at asking for help, prone to carrying things alone past the point where carrying them alone made sense. He had made mistakes in Chicago, calls that had taken longer to work out than they should have because he'd been overconfident in his read of a situation, personnel decisions that required adjustment, a vendor conversation in week 6 that had gone sideways before it went right. He was not a finished person. He was a person in the middle of his life, doing what he could with what he had, trying to leave whatever room he moved through in better condition than he found it. That was enough. He had decided a long time ago that that was enough. The pasta was done. He called Emma, who appeared immediately in the way she only did when she was hungry, and they ate at the kitchen table with her book report pushed to one side and the weather systems project still visible on the counter with its cotton ball clouds and blue construction paper ocean. "Tell me something good that happened today," he said. It was their thing, had been since she was 4, the question asked at dinner that insisted on at least one true positive thing from the day, even the difficult ones. Emma thought about it, chewing. "Jalen said my weather project was the best one." "Is Jalen the one whose dad said doing the right thing was stupid?" "Yeah." "What did you say?" "I said thank you." She took another bite. "And then I told him the diagonal sandwich thing is also science, not just feelings, and he should do his own experiment." Ethan looked at his daughter, at the complete certainty in her, the particular confidence of a 7-year-old who has not yet learned to distrust her own convictions, who still believed that what was true, and what was right, and that the work of saying so was usually worth it. He thought, don't lose that. He thought, I'll do what I can. "Something good," she said, pointing at him with her fork. "Your turn." He thought about the 34th floor in Cincinnati, the bill on the desk, the permanent contract in his bag, 233 people who would come in tomorrow and the day after that and be treated like the capable, complicated human beings they were. "A lot of things worked out today," he said. "Things I wasn't completely sure were going to work out." Emma considered this. "All at once?" "More or less." She nodded slowly, processing. "That's a good day." "Yeah," he said. "That's a good day." They finished dinner. He washed the dishes and she dried them, which was their agreement, even though her drying was approximate at best, and he usually re-dried whatever she handed him after she'd gone back to her book report. It was the participation that mattered, the standing next to each other in the kitchen at the end of the day, the ordinary small work of it, the fact of being there. Outside, November was pressing its cold and dark against the windows, and the neighborhood had gone quiet in the early evening way of places where people went home to their lives and closed the door on the rest of it. Inside the house on the west side of Chicago, a former Navy SEAL stood at the kitchen sink finishing the dishes his daughter had approximately dried, and his daughter was back at the kitchen table with her book report, and the heating pad was on the counter, and there was still a drawing of a dog they didn't own on the refrigerator. It was not a perfect life. It had never been a perfect life. But it was a life that had been built by showing up to it honestly, by doing the thing the moment asked for even when the cost was real, by trusting that the person you chose to be in the hard minutes was the same person you had to live with in all the other minutes. The $20 bill was on a desk in Cincinnati. The branch was standing. The people in it were doing their work with their heads up. That was the shape of what had happened. That was all of it, and it was enough, and it was real. Ethan dried his hands, turned off the kitchen light over the sink, and went to go check what Emma had written so far about weather systems, because she had been giving him updates on meteorological phenomena for a week, and it seemed only right to see what she'd done with all of it. The evening continued the way evenings do when nothing else is asked of them, quietly, at its own pace, belonging entirely to itself.